Hello everyone, my name is Stefano Grancini and this is Connected, the podcast of Nova Economics Club. This podcast is done in partnership with Fidelidade Studio. A special thanks to Fidelidade for giving us access to their studio and equipments. Okay, so let me introduce our guest for today. In this fourth podcast, we are going to talk with Anna Balcao-Reis, Associate Professor of Nova SB and researcher at the Economics of Education Knowledge Center. And then we have Caterina Angello, researcher at the Economics of Education Knowledge Center and teaching assistant at Nova SB. Welcome and thank you for being here. And let's start our talk that is going to focus on the access to higher education for students. Welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We were looking at some data and we saw that in percentage of GDP, the Portuguese public expenditure in education has increased since the 70s until 2002, year in which it reached a level of 5.1% of the GDP. However, since 2002, this percentage has been decreasing, reaching the 3.53% of the GDP in 2019, the lowest relative value since 1987. Some changes happened with the higher education investment. Professor, do you find this number a reason for concern?
Well, I think that we have to be careful when looking at these values for expenditure. One thing is that what decreased was the percentage on GDP for the total level of education, for total expenditure on education. And we have to take into account that the number of students also decreased because we have an aging population, so our population is older today than it was like 40 years ago. The number of students at school, at below higher education, decreased. And so if we do the calculations per student, it's not clear that we decreased the value that we are spending per student. This is one point. Another point is what is being spent on higher education, and there we have to distinguish between the private spending and the public spending, and probably should look at both together. And it's not clear, and we can discuss it later, which part should be from the public expenditure and the private at the higher education level, because there you have private returns that are very high, and it's not clear that they should all be financed by public expenditure.
Sure.
Let me just another point, which is that the literature that exists on expenditure in education, it is not clear that just by increasing the expenditure we would increase the level of education, the quality of education, or the growth of the country. Although we have a strong correlation between level of education and the level of development of countries, the correlation is between the level of education of the workforce and the level of development of the country. It's not between the expenditure and the level of development of the country. Okay? And it's not clear at all in the data that just by increasing how much we spend on education, this will increase the quality of education. We have to look at where we spend the money.
Yes, and regarding where we spend the money, do you think there are certain investments that are better than others?
Yes, but there what I would say is that probably when we think about public money or public funds, I would focus on not higher education, on maybe beginning even in the kindergarten or even below,
yes,
small kids, primary education, and then at the level of higher education, probably it makes sense to have, some public funds for people that came from low socioeconomic families with low socioeconomic status, but I think it makes sense that the private contribution is also relevant.
Okay, thank you. So now let's start to think how it could be improved, the access to higher education. The Exame Nacional de Matemática A of 2020 showed an average grade of 13 out of 20, but a mode of 19 out of 20. The Portuguese Math Society stated that this exam didn't allow the outstanding student to demark themselves from the rest of the good ones, meaning that some of those outstanding students might have been stopped from entering in the course they wanted because some of the good ones were able to take a much better grade than they were supposed to. Do you think that this supports that argument that Portugal will need a new system of access to higher education?
Well, no, I don't. Definitely not. I just think that in this particular year, the national exam in mathematics didn't allow for a good selection of students, as the Portuguese Mathematics Society states. In fact, I think that our system is a pretty good one. Okay, so let's first see how our system works. So on one hand, we select students based on their performance during secondary school. Okay, so we consider their average grades, and also we consider the grades the scores they obtain in national exams. Okay, so in a way that we can in fact rank them in the same, having the same scale, because they all take the same exam. Now this is the way the system works. We take into account both of them. And they are both strong predictors of future success in life, namely in the workplace. We have studies from former students here at Nova that mention and find exactly that both the scores obtained in national exams and the scores from secondary school are good determinants for success in life. Having in mind that this effect is stronger when we look at secondary school scores. Now another thing...
Let me just add on this that first I think it's interesting to say that there are 2 papers already on this, using the data from the Portuguese educational system, which we have pretty good data, and they combine already the work projects of 3 of our master students here from Nova SB. So it's interesting that we have students being able to do these studies with this data in the framework of the Knowledge Center of Economics of Education. And one point that we saw was that, okay, these two measures are good predictors of the results of the students in higher education. But we did this evaluation, so the studies that were done are done in a framework where everyone in the system, both students and teachers, know that at the end of the year there will be a national exam. And so it's not, although the results are that both are good predictors of the final outcome, and that what Catarina just said, the final GPA from high school is a strong predictor than the grades on the exams, this is in a framework where everyone knows that there will be an exam. And so when we are, as economists, we know that the incentives determine behaviors, and so it's not clear that if we eliminate the exams, the grades would have the same behavior. Okay, we are studying this in a framework where we have both. And everyone knows that after the grades given by teachers, after everything that happens during the year, there will be an exam in the end which somehow confirms the grade given by the teacher. But Catarina was adding some other points.
There is one thing I need to add to what I've just said and what Anna reinforced, is that, okay, the system, I believe it's good. And again, I don't think that what happened this year is an indication that we should change it. But what I do see from the data, from a work that I have developed, is that the system that we have, so consider, and the weights we attribute to both the secondary school scores and the exam are not neutral for students. So some students, for some students, it would be better to have a higher weight attributed to one of the measures, and for others it would be better to have a higher weight attributed to the other. namely in what concerns gender, we know that it is not the same. So that is something I think we should consider and analyze to try to see how this impacts different students in different ways. I don't know if I made myself clear or not.
Yeah, sure.
So it's not the same to attribute 50% to final GPA and 50% to exams than reversing this.
Yeah, and
Moreover,
yeah, I think you can even be more concrete
precise.
because
Yeah.
this is Katerina work for her PhD, so she's working on this. And what Katerina saw, and there are other studies for other countries that show the same,
Yes.
is that for girls, usually it's better that the high school GPA have a higher weight, and for boys, the opposite is true. It would be better if the exams had a higher weight. Probably because these two things measure different dimensions, different elements of evaluation, and probably both are relevant, but for one type of students, one is better, for the others, the other is better.
So we have talked about this difference about male and females, but do you think there is also an impact coming from private schools? I mean, I can explain it better. Do you think that the fact that in the common opinion there is this idea that higher secondary school grades coming from private school are higher, this could be an enforcing signal in the role of income and financial constraints on higher education attainment?
Okay, there are some studies again done by the Ministry of Education and the General Direction for Statistics, using again microdata, so going to the individual level, where they show that it's not totally clear that the difference. So what you're speaking is about like inflation on grades.
Yeah.
Grades that are too high, higher than they should be, taking into account the level of achievement of the students. And it's not totally clear that this is higher for private schools. We also have like a region effect. In the north, this happens more than in the south. And it can be for a vicious cycle because maybe what happened was that some schools began to give higher grades, and then the others that are nearby have to follow them, because otherwise they will be it will be bad for their students. So it can be this, but it's true that there are some clear examples that people know, and the ministry have already acted on that. There are some specific schools where we have inflation on grades, but it's not something that we can say it's private. The problem is private schools. We also have that in some public schools, and it's an issue, and probably this is why it's so important to combine high school grades with exams, because in that combining both, you also have a measure to see if there is inflation or not, inflation on grades. So you can have an external evaluation that tells you how things are going, and at the same time you are taking into account the different dimensions that are relevant in terms of the achievement of the students.
It was very clear and very interesting. Now let's talk a little bit about social justice in education. So in 2010, the investment of Portuguese government in social support for college students was more than 136 million, which represented almost 0.27% of the total public expenditure. However, 9 years later, in 2019, this amount was just 70 million, representing only the 0.13% of the total public expenditure, despite the number of college students being one of the highest ever. How does this neglect of social support might affect the possibilities that public higher education will continue to be inclusive and accessible for everyone?
Okay, I think we can look at different aspects, and let me say that I'm going to go back to the previous question in this sense, because the justice that you're mentioning, I think, is relevant in different dimensions. It's relevant in terms of giving everyone the opportunity to access higher education, and that the the money that they have, the social condition of people doesn't condition the access to higher education. It's also relevant that the system that we use to select students is fair. Okay? So that's why I go back to the previous question, because the system of access is also important in terms of fairness. And many times we hear people speaking about other countries. You mentioned that when we discussed this previously, and other systems. And it's not clear that things like interviews or recommendation letters would increase the fairness, because probably the people that already came from better social environments already would also be the students that would have better recommendation letters, better references, maybe other experience besides schools because they have the opportunities to have these experiences. So it's not clear that that would, at least that would increase the access to higher education of people from lower social background. So I think we should be careful when we discuss these other ways of assessing higher education. Obviously they could have some advantage, but I'm sure they would also have some disadvantage. And in terms of the fairness and of the openness of the system to people from lower socioeconomic background, I think there is a risk there. And we can see this on the countries where this system are applied. Okay. Another thing, maybe you should speak about the Italian system. I'm going to say something and you can confirm if it's true. One thing that we had in Italy and France previously was there were no numerous clauses, at least in the majority of the degrees. And again, there we have a problem. I think we should not decrease the number of clauses, we should increase the number of clauses in Portugal. We should have more slots in Portugal to increase the number of people that can access higher education. But going to the limit that we had in France and Italy, I believe, that everyone that applied could enter. And then what we had was that in the first year at higher education, the classes were so large that the quality was very low. And there was some adjustment on the systems in France clearly, and I believe in Italy at least in many degrees.
This is what happens in the public schools in particular, and there is a huge debate regarding the fact to put exam to enter in every school, at least to do some screening, but for now it is the access is for everyone.
Yeah. But I believe in some degrees it already changed. Even in Italy, you can confirm this, and in France also.
Yes.
Exactly, because it's also important to guarantee the quality of what is done in higher education. So we have to combine this, the fairness of the process, increasing the number of people that can access higher education, and then the quality of what we offer in higher education. Going to the funding, which was your question. I think it's important that we find a way that the people that come from low socioeconomic status can also access higher education. If we think about the Portuguese system, the level of tuitions is not really the main issue. Tuitions are already very low. There are other costs that are more relevant. And we see this here when we have some scholarships that were, there was a group of alumni that created the scholarship, Innova, and when we began, these scholarships began to be given, they were for tuitions, and it was very fast for us to discover that what students need was not to pay the tuition, which is like a small expenditure. The lodging, the housing, it's much more expensive. Even the transport, so if people have to pay, they come from, if they don't live near the university, it may be more expensive than the tuitions. So it's important that we give some support. It's not clear that tuitions are the way to go. And what the international studies show is that the main reason why we don't we observe in Portugal and in other countries. The main reason why we observe that for someone from a student from a low socioeconomic status has a lower probability to access higher education, it's not really the liquidity constraint at the moment of deciding or not to go to higher education, is everything that happens before that. So what we see is that at the end of high school, there is a huge correlation between the level of income of the family and the grades. If we have this high correlation, and we rank students by their grades, what will happen is that those students that came from low socioeconomic status and tend to have lower grades, of course there are exceptions, but tend to have lower grades, will find it more difficult to access higher education. And so if we want to increase the access to higher education for people from low socioeconomic status, the main policy would be increasing the quality of education on basic education for everyone. It's not decreasing tuitions, it's decreasing the correlation between grades and socioeconomic status in basic education. And if we look at the results from PISA, the last ones, what they showed is that for Portugal, the correlation between results and socioeconomic status at 15 years old, which is the age students take the PISA, is very high, and it's higher than in the other European countries. So probably this is where policy should go, the main policy would be this, to decrease inequality at the level of basic education, because this would allow everyone to be in a more similar position when the access to higher education is decided. I don't know if you want to add.
No.
Thank you. Yeah, it was very interesting.
Totally agree.
But now let's see how Europe Union can make an impact on this, because as you know, European funds have always represented an important part of the money available for research and development in Portugal due to European programs like the EU 2020 or the European Fund for Regional Development. So should the European Union try to have a bigger impact on the access to higher education of most of the European countries by investing not only in the research and development, but also putting some money in infrastructures and new technologies for colleges and students?
I agree that it would make sense for things like this, the ones you mentioned, in the sense that we know that, as I said, it's not just spending money on education that will make the country grow faster, but spending the money on some specific resources that are relevant for the quality of education will be good. And digitalization in general is something that we need to increase on higher education. It would be good. Lodging for students is something that is also infrastructure, and it could help because from what I said before, probably this is one of the most relevant costs for people from low socioeconomic status or people that live in less urban areas, in more rural areas. So I think this using or the European Union agreeing or allowing to use some of these funds for these specific uses, so it's not to pay tuitions, but it's to have better infrastructure at universities for those things, IT, digitalization, and also some basic infrastructure for students like lodging. That would be important.
Or maybe, for
Housing.
example, using like a kind of European scholarship, I don't know if it is already exists, also to cover some needs that students could have.
Yeah, there I think that one thing that is being implemented in some countries, and we now have Fundação José Neves. I don't know if you know, it's a new foundation in Portugal from the owner of Farfetch, that he created a foundation that was launched like 1 month, no, less than that.
Less than that.
2 weeks ago, maybe. And one of the policies they are implementing, one of the actions, are contingent loans for higher education. They're not doing it for bachelor's yet. They're doing it for, and it's not necessarily for higher education. It's for programs with 2 years or less. So it can be a master, but it can also be some training on programming, things like this. And they are offering contingent loans. Contingent loans are, they lend the money, but then the people that borrow it to pay their studies will pay it back depending on how much they receive as income. So they only need to pay if they receive a minimum amount, and it's a proportion of their income. And so if they are unemployed, they don't have to pay. So the risk is very small, let's say. The risk belongs to the foundation. And this is a pretty good way to support the access to education.
Okay, nice. Now let's try to resume and to conclude the podcast, talking a little bit about the future of Portugal and what we could expect from the Portuguese government. Because data regarding public investment in education shows a drop from 2000 to 2019. Should we expect the same decreasing trend for the next few years, or is this trend likely to reverse? And do you think that is more important focusing on the efficiency of the investments that have been done? You have already said, but let's try to see more regarding the Portugal situations.
As I said, I don't. Investment in education is important, and I'm sure that it's important to finance, but more the preschool, to have preschool cheaper for everyone, probably for free for everyone that wants it, as we have primary education, which is still not the case. And even for usually this doesn't appear on the statistics for education, but having the childbearing from babies to 3 years old, it doesn't count as education, but probably it should, because things begin at this level. And there's where you have a lot of inequality. So I wouldn't be so worried. Of course, we also, I'm in a public school, I need to say I need money. But probably this is not if we are speaking about inequality and improving the achievement of the population, probably the most important investment is for small children. For higher education, I believe that the policies that are relevant have more to do with autonomy of these higher education institutions, and also some support in terms of digitalization, but very specific things.
So this is the final suggestion, that you would feel to give investments in specific things to help directly students.
I'm not sure if it is to help directly students at higher education.
Mm-hmm.
For higher education, I think that for students, things like contingent loans, and in UK and Australia and New Zealand, these contingent loans are run by the state, not the state, but by public institutions. This could be an interesting solution. And this also needs some funds, because as I said, they are supporting the risk, so that they need some funds to do that.
I have nothing to add. I just totally agree with the fact that investment should start very, very early in a child's life. So if we guarantee that, we can make sure that we decrease inequality and raise quality of the educational system overall. That's all.
Okay, for me it was a pleasure to having you here and to listen and also to solve some doubts that we all had. And I hope to have you here again for another podcast one day. So thank you both.
Okay, thank you for the invitation.
And also thank you all guys for having listened to the Force Connected podcast, and see you guys at next Nova Economics Club podcast.